Okay, I think we'll probably go ahead and get started here this afternoon. My name is James Robson. I'm the Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard Asia Center, and I'd like to welcome all of you for joining us today for this second in the this fall's Philippine lecture series at the Harvard University Asia Center. Before introducing this afternoon's speaker and the talk, I wanted to mention that we'll be having one more speaker in the fall lecture series, which will be on November 17th at 4 p.m., also held on Zoom, and that'll be a talk by Elsa Clave from the University of Hamburg, and the title of the talk is going to be Visiting Shrines, Holding Manuscripts on the Footsteps of Islamicization in the Philippines. So please join us on the 17th if you can make it. So we are, and I should also mention the structure for today's talk is that this is in a webinar format, and therefore anybody who would like to ask a question during the question and answer period, please use the Q&A function that's on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will help to curate those questions for our speaker this afternoon. Okay. So I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker this afternoon, which is Professor Vicente L. Rafael, who is a professor of history and Southeast Asian studies at the University of Washington in Seattle, where he began in 2003 after teaching at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and also at the University of California in San Diego. He's also been awarded a number of postdoctoral fellowships at the University of California, Irvine, the Stanford Humanities Center, and has been a Guggenheim and a Rockefeller Fellow as well. And I'm extremely honored to host him today for this talk, since as I was building the series on the Philippines, which started last year, it was actually the first set of talks that we had. And whenever I asked around, about who was doing interesting new work on the Philippines, Vicente's name always came up. And then as I spent some time reading everything I could find that he's written, I was really impressed and blown away by the breadth, the depth, and the methodological innovations of his work. In any case, he received his PhD from Cornell University and also his MA from Cornell University and his BA from Ateneo de Manila University in 1977. He was trained primarily in Southeast Asian history, European intellectual history and anthropology, and his research interests include areas on language and power, the politics of translation and literature, comparative colonialisms and nationalism, the social history of media and mediation, critical theory and anthropology, empire, race, and gender. Much of his writing has been on the colonial and post-colonial Philippines and the United States, and he's authored a number of really fascinating works on the political and cultural history of the Philippines that include Contracting Colonialism, also White Love and Other Events in Filipino History, The Promise of the Foreign and Motherless Tongues, the insurgency of language amid wars of translation. And his most recent book is entitled The Sovereign Trickster, Death and Laughter in the Age of Duterte, that was published by Duke University just this year in 2022. And I believe all the earlier books are also published by Duke, if I recall correctly. So Professor Rafael's talk today is entitled How Revolutionary Was the Philippine Revolution? And I will now turn the mic over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, James. And thank you, technical help for this talk. Thanks for everyone for coming. I hope in the wake of, Lenny Robredo's taught the other day that some of this will be sort of interesting and provide some food for thought. I wrote this paper but then I decided to revive it, in part because of an attempt to come to terms with this sort of political sort of change, some would say catastrophe, that's been happening in the contemporary Philippines. And it's led people to sort of think about what are the possibilities for revolutionary changes, for radical changes in the future? And my own personal background is that I've gone from being very optimistic about radical changes, in the wake of the 60s, the 70s, and then its overthrow of the Marxists, to a somewhat more sort of pessimistic outlook about the possibilities for revolutionary changes. And I've tried to account for that pessimism by, as a historian, by looking historically at what's gone on, right, in the history of the revolution. And so this paper sort of comes out in the wake of that. In this talk, what I want to do is offer an alternative understanding of the revolution and whether it was actually a continuation of, rather than emancipation of colonialism. Here, let me share my slides. I think I've got it here. Okay. In addition, I want to probe into the contradictions of the revolution going against the grain of popular interpretation. It may provide us with a way of understanding the sort of oligarchic authoritarianism that exists today as part of, in part has allowed for the Dutertes and the Marcoses to rule. And finally, I will try to do a brief comparison of the revolution with those of the Americas in the late 18th and 19th century to show how it was part of a global, it was part of a wave of global liberal modernity for better or worse. Now, over the years, there have been many excellent accounts of the revolution, including those by Teodoro Goncillo, Reynaldo Ileto, and the treasure trove of Katipunan documents compiled, translated, and annotated by Jim Richardson. Among the most astute of these histories is Milagros Guerrero's Luzon at War, Contradictions in Philippine Society, for which I've written an introduction and annotation. The title of Guerrero's book is itself striking. It uses the word war to characterize what in Philippine historiography is regarded as the second phase of the Philippine Revolution. As the subtitle, Contradictions in Philippine Society, indicates, the emergence of the Malolos, or First Republic, in September of 1898, in the wake of the defeat of Spain and the U.S. capture of Manila, marked not so much the triumph of revolution as the outbreak of all sorts of wars. Wars, for example, between Filipinos and Americans, between the civilian and the military leadership of the Republic, and between the elite leadership and the rest of the populace they sought to command. The question, though, is how did these wars, as violent articulations of social contradictions, shape the revolution? How did these various struggles curtail or promote the political energies and utopian hopes released by the common struggle against Spanish colonial rule and U.S. imperial invasion? What do these wars tell us about the limits and possibilities of Asia's first anti-colonial revolution? In other words, how did these wars further revolutionary goals? And whose goals? Whose revolution? Indeed, how revolutionary was the Philippine Revolution when viewed from the perspective of the wars of contradiction that is the First Republic? Nationalist historiography tends to divide the revolution into two distinct periods. The first phase, from 1896 to 1897, characterized as, quote, the revolt of the masses, followed by the second phase, from 1898 to 1902, regarded as the counter-revolutionary takeover of the Republic by wealthy ilustrados, who, in collaborating with the Americans, have been blamed for the defeat of the revolution. The term revolt of the masses, of course, comes from Agoncillo's classic account of the Katipunan, written in 1948, but published only in 1956, as the embers of the Hook Rebellion still glowed brightly in central Luzon. Agoncillo's contention that the revolution, unlike the Ilustrado-led propaganda movement, was largely a, quote, plebeian effort, was first popularized by Isabelo de los Reyes in 1899. However, more recent scholarship by Rusil Mojares, Benedict Anderson, Jim Richardson, and Michael Cullinane, among others, alongside the earlier innovative work of Nick Joaquin, all show that there was nothing at all proletarian about the leadership of the revolution. Furthermore, the distinction between revolutionary and counter-revolutionary phase may in fact be spurious, given the remarkable continuity in the leadership and ideology of the revolution and the First Republic. Jim Richardson, in his massive compilation, translation, annotation of the documents of the revolutionary organization, the Katipunan, calls our attention to the fact that from its inception, the Katipunan's membership was made up largely of educated and gainfully employed middle classes. It was only much later on that people from the lower classes would eventually join the Katipunan. More than half of those present at the cry of Balintawak, which inaugurated the revolution, for example, had positions in the colonial bureaucracy, while the rest were printers, merchants, and teachers. There were only two so-called laborers. Only later on, as the revolution spread, would the Katipunan attract followers from the lower classes. Similarly, Michael Cullinane refers to the members of the Katipunan as those from the, quote, middle sector, an awkward term that nonetheless gets at the ambiguity of the social and political positions of the early Katipuneros. These were two types. First, the salaried urban empleados, printers, office workers, court transcribers, warehouse clerks, bookkeepers, and the like. And second, the municipal and provincial principales, village heads and their relatives who administered local affairs. The growth of this middle sector was a function of the expanded colonial educational system. Starting with the educational reforms of 1863, the Castilian language became more widely taught thanks to the work of schoolmasters trained at the normal school and licensed by the University of Santo Tomas to set up their own private schools in their houses. The emergence of new secondary schools in the middle of the 19th century, such as the Ateneo Municipal and the San Juan de Letran in Manila, along with the University of San Carlos in Cebu, the only one of its kind south of Manila, further increased the number of Castilian speakers. The rise in the supply of educated colonials came at a point when there was a sharp increase in the demand for their services. This demand came from two sources, which I will talk about in a second. First, the colonial bureaucracy, which had expanded in the aftermath of Spain's laws of its American possessions, and the growing numbers, secondly, of Anglo-European commercial houses in the colony. These two developments are closely related. A series of wars from the mid-18th century to the early 19th century dealt Spain a series of major losses. First from the British during the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763, then from the Napoleonic invasions from 1808 to 1814, and most devastatingly in the protracted wars of American independence between 1810 to 1821 that led to the loss of its American colonies. Seeking ways to recover from these catastrophic defeats, Spain sought to find ways to rationalize governance and maximize the exploitation of the remaining archipelagic colonies. They needed to find ways to accumulate profits and build up a credible military with which to protect and project the power of the existing empire. In the Philippine colony, such imperatives led Spain to establish what turned out to be their first profitable venture: the forced cultivation and sale of tobacco between 1782 to 1883, dramatically altering the ecology and political economy of the Cagayan Valley in the north. By 1834, they also liberalized commerce by opening the Philippines to foreign traders and allowing back Chinese traders who had been expelled for aiding the British in its occupation of Manila, a move that was necessary in view of the end of the galleon trade in 1815. Euro-American commercial houses rushed into the colony to set off branch offices. Working through Chinese middlemen, they extended credit to farmers and purchased crops for export to the world market, such as sugar, tobacco, abaca, and the like. Thus did the Anglo-American, European, and Chinese traders intensify an agricultural revolution whose seeds had already been planted by the Bourbon reforms in the Spanish monopoly of tobacco. As it expanded, the colonial state required more clerks to push paper, transcribe, and translate trials. And for example, it's interesting to note that the famous Tagalog poet Francisco Balagtas was himself a court translator to keep records, collect taxes, police the colony, and so forth. Similarly, foreign commercial houses sought educated workers to serve as clerks, artisans, printers, and so on to run their day-to-day operations. Hence, did new sources of employment open up for newly educated colonials. As wage workers, literate in Castilian, they formed a new social group never before seen in the colony. Finally, the Dominican-run University of Santo Tomas had expanded its curricular offerings and increased its enrollments. Despite its reputation as a bastion of reaction, UST was responsible for educating a whole generation of some of the most militant male nationalists of the era. In short, imperial wars and territorial losses forced Spain to make dramatic, often violent reforms based on increased capitalist exploitation of the colony. Such reforms had radical effects, squeezing profits from every pore. The ensemble of practices and institutions of colonial capitalism altered the fabric of social relations, even as it expanded the coercive capacities of the state. Taken as a whole, these developments set conditions for the emergence of a novel revolutionary class. Like the wealthier ilustrados, members of this middle-class sector felt the weight of Spanish demands for increased taxation, while at the same time suffering the daily hurt of racist exclusion. Conscious of other possible futures and imbued with a new progressive outlook, not unlike those who traveled to Europe, the more localized middle sectors began to take on a cosmopolitan outlook, moving between Castilian and their vernacular languages within the shared spaces of the oficina and the casa tribunales, having gone to the same schools, reading the same newspapers, attuned to the same gossip, and sharing the same gripes. They bore the same humiliations along with a common history of violent persecutions. As such, they began to form what Benedict Anderson had famously called an imagined community, feeling entitled yet excluded from legal equality, economic opportunity, and cultural respect by peninsular Spaniards. They began to dream of another world, one that entailed separation from Spain by way of armed struggle. By 1892, a small number organized a secret society in Manila called the Katipunan, dedicated to carrying out precisely such a project. Influenced in part by Rizal's short-lived mutual aid organization, the Liga Filipina, the Katipunan from the outset was liberal in its orientation. The members of the secret society had much in common with the Ilustrados, and in fact, a few of its earliest members came from this class of people. This did not mean that they were indifferent to the various millenarian colorum sects that had begun to emerge in various parts of the country, especially in the aftermath of Hermano Pule's 1841 Tayabas revolt. But rather than draw their ideological and organizational features from the colorum sects, it was the colorums themselves that would come to appropriate aspects of the Katipunan's discourse and set up later on. Not surprisingly, Katipunan liberalism was articulated not only in the Tagalog language, but also in the symbols of Freemasonry and bits of the French Enlightenment, rather in the rituals of the Catholic Church or some other folk epic like the Passion. While the early Katipunan emphasized the need for social and racial equality, its main goal was to unite the Philippine colony under its leadership for the sake of overthrowing Spain. It sought the formation of a, quote, unified, compact, vigorous, and homogeneous body, as some of its founding documents indicate, that would become a new sovereign nation. However, the goal of unity and homogeneity also meant sidestepping, if not suppressing, differences, ethnic, class, regional, even religious. Rarely do the Katipunan documents make mention of such social categories. This avoidance of difference was as strategic as it was ideological. The secret society aimed primarily at regime change, not social change. It never had a program for addressing social inequalities, only for instituting legal equality within the terms of Spanish civil law. Neither did it furnish a theory or an analysis of social conflicts. Instead, the Katipunan offered moral exhortations a la Rizal, urging its members to lead virtuous lives. As such, the Katipunan never planned to redistribute land or to democratize social relations. This would have been difficult, if not impossible, given that its leadership was made up of male, urban middle classes and provincial elites. Its revolutionary aims were thus limited to replacing the Spaniards on top with male Filipino leaders and limiting, though not banishing, the church's power by neutralizing the influence of Spanish friars, again, a standard liberal goal. It is well known that deep factional divisions tore through the Katipunan ranks beginning in the middle of 1896. Beginning the late 1896, culminating in March, May of 1897. One of the founders of the Katipunan, often referred to as the father of the revolution, Andres Bonifacio, was executed for plotting a coup as Emilio Aguinaldo became president of the Revolutionary Republic. At play was a larger intra-class conflict among emergent and aspiring middle classes over who should control the revolution. No alternative visions of utopia or sharply divergent ideological stances were at stake. Members of the factional rivals, Magdiwang and Magdalo, easily slid into each other as practical needs determined their allegiances. By the time Aguinaldo and his brothers broke away to plot an uprising, most of his most trusted followers had already deserted him and gone to the side of Aguinaldo's revolutionary government. This was happening just as Spanish reinforcements were bearing down to retake the province of Cavite, where these events were happening. In the end, nearly everyone but a small group deserted Bonifacio. Heeding Aguinaldo's appeal and realizing Bonifacio's loss of popular support, they took the practical step of siding with the larger forces of Aguinaldo's government. So if we want to blame anyone for Bonifacio's tragic execution, we should not blame just Aguinaldo, but everyone else in the Republic. Del Pilar, Noriel, Ricarte, and so forth, were complicit to the execution, even urging Aguinaldo not to commute the death sentence. However, by the middle of 1897, Aguinaldo himself was forced to go into exile in Hong Kong after signing the Treaty of Biak-na-Bato in the face of Spanish advances. Sustained inter-class conflicts arguably did not emerge until much later, from 1898 to 1899, with the return of Aguinaldo, courtesy of the U.S. Navy, which had just defeated the Spanish Armada in Manila Bay. Lacking in the ground troops, which were not to arrive until months later in 1898, the Americans sought to use Filipino revolutionaries under Aguinaldo's leadership to clear the Philippines of Spaniards. Everywhere in the archipelago, the relatively swift defeat of Spanish forces led to openings into which new forces could rush in to take advantage of the sudden collapse of colonial authority. Aguinaldo quickly declared independence on June 12, 1898, but blocked by U.S. forces from taking over Manila, he led his troops to Malolos, north of the city, to form the First Republic. Meanwhile, peasant groups and urban strikers had begun to ride the revolutionary wave, insisting on their rights. For their efforts, they found themselves faced with the First Republic's heavy-handed attempt to assert its authority. It sought to raise funds by imposing new taxes while reviving old ones: poll taxes, sales taxes, taxes for transporting goods, for selling them, for buying them, etc. In addition, after initially ending forced labor, the Republic restored it as a way of drafting men into the militias. The result was economic disaster. Able-bodied men were removed from their fields and no one was left to plant and harvest crops. Food shortages were common, along with frequent starvation. Trade suffered and currency devaluation and inflation occurred to further decimate the economy. The Republic needed to secure the support of provincial elites who provided much needed material and military support. It conducted highly restrictive elections that would safeguard elite positions, and exclude the majority of the people. Thus began the history of a weak central state finding itself dependent upon strong local units. In order to keep local elites close while satisfying the pent-up demand of other elites for property, the Republic initiated a period of intense land grabbing, seeking to transfer ownership of the friar lands to the Republican leaders, a process that U.S. rule would later consolidate with its purchase and sale of friar lands from the Vatican. Furthermore, it sought to float a national loan whereby Congress mortgaged the assets of the country to wealthy ilustrados in exchange for loans to finance the fight. What would have been a massive transfer of wealth to the rich was temporarily interrupted by the U.S. invasion and fall of the Republic. Adding to the problems of the Republic was the fact that Congress was unable and perhaps unwilling to curb the ongoing abuses of its military forces. As with most volunteer forces, the soldiers relied on donations and, barring that, on pillage. It was not uncommon for them to steal food, money, and jewelry, as well as engage in rape and other violations. But instead of alleviating the plight of the masses, the Republic proved unable to rein in soldiers whose primary loyalty were to local elite commanders. Indeed, rather than curb military abuses, Republican forces often responded to people's complaints with brutal military repression, exactly as if it were another colonial power. As dispatches from the field indicate, some people began to regard the Republic as worse than Spain. For those at the receiving end of what appeared to be a host of excessive demands, the revolution, as represented by its Republican agents, seemed no more than quote unquote a swindle. Aguinaldo himself became so despondent at the turn of events that he once drafted a resignation letter, and only Apolinario Mabini's prodding kept him from quitting. Not surprisingly, peasant armies claiming to be revivals of the true Katipunan, or as militarian communities awaiting the coming of Kalayaan or freedom, emerged to fight the Republic. As Reynaldo Ileto, Milagros Guerrero, and Renato Constantino and others have shown, class warfare erupted in many parts of Luzon. These movements fomented decidedly non-liberal and more radical versions of the revolution. Rail workers, tobacco workers, domestic servants struck for their rights in Manila. Uprisings exploded in many of the towns in Pangasinan, Tarlac, Pampanga, Ilocos, the Cordilleras, and the southern Tagalog regions. Examples include the Pensacola brothers and Zambales, who were famous for their motto, quote, "It was time for the rich to become poor and the poor to become rich," close quote. Peasant groups attacked government offices and burned documents, thinking that by doing so, they could now claim the lands they had been tilling. They harassed and attacked tax collectors, squatted on hacienda lands, and set up communes such as the Guardia de Honor or the Santa Iglesia, led by former Katipunero Felipe Salvador. Some formed Katipunans and alternative republics in the mountains of Sierra Madre, like Macario Sakay. There, people lived free from taxes and labor demands under the leadership of self-styled popes and prophets. Surviving meant praying while raiding surrounding haciendas for their supplies. Seeing these groups as threats because of the radical social changes they demanded, the Republic sought either to curb or to crush them. While radical impulses towards social leveling existed among some of the revolutionary fighters, among the leadership of the Katipunan and the First Republic, there was no such shift from revolutionary to a counter-revolutionary movement. Presiding over the Republic were wealthy as well as aspirational ilustrados, alongside the provincial elite leadership of the Katipunan. Both agreed on the essentials of a liberal social order. The nation was to be ruled by, quote, "an oligarchy of the mind," as Felipe Calderon famously said, composed of the wealthiest and most learned people, while the place and power of local elites, many of whom owed their position to the Spanish colonial order, would be preserved and expanded. While there were calls for social equality, While there were calls for racial equality, there was never a question of redistributing wealth or instituting progressive taxation. There was certainly no talk of social leveling, only the protection and enhancement of the privileges and properties of the landed against the usurpations of the poor. Sending out ambassadors to the United States and Europe, the Republic is far more concerned with seeking international recognition than with securing local legitimation. Again, this was because the revolution, from the perspective of its leaders, was always about regime change and less about social transformation. The question arises, why then was the revolution so politically bold, yet so socially conservative? To answer this question, we need to locate the revolution's social conservatism in relation to its historical conditions of possibility. As we saw earlier, social revolution, understood as the radical transformation of society, was brought about not by the revolution of 1896 to 1902, but by the liberalizing reforms of the Spanish colonial government. From the end of the British occupation in 1764, and especially with the end of the galleon trade in 1815, wave upon wave of innovations washed into the archipelago's shores. An abbreviated list might include the following: the liberalization of trade and the opening of Manila to European and American merchants, the commercialization of agriculture, the expansion and rationalization of the bureaucracy, the introduction of a new penal code that instituted civil law, the centralization of military forces in the form of the Guardia Civil, the educational reforms that led to increased literacy in Castilian, and the rise of trade schools in navigation, art, and music, the introduction of new infrastructure such as steamships, railroad, telegraphy, telephony, waterworks, street lighting, and the like, the growth of secular publishing, theater, and even Freemasonry, all of which had the cumulative effect of enlarging and secularizing the colonial public sphere. Finally, there were renewed attempts to conquer vast areas that had long laid outside of the Spanish grasp, chiefly Muslim Mindanao and the non-Christian Cordilleras. These imperial projects, as uneven as they were destructive of seizing non-Christianized areas, would continue through the American colonial period and the post-war Republican periods, clear up to the present day. These and other changes uprooted and revolutionized colonial society, which had been, till the late 18th century, dominated by the older technologies, bodily disciplines, and reified social hierarchies of Catholicism and friar power. Successive reform efforts imposed by the Bourbon monarchy and later by the liberal Spanish Cortes, reforms which intensified after the loss of Spanish America in the 1820 and the Revolution of 1868, as Spain sought to save its empire, had the effect of radically transforming Philippine colonial society from the ground up, bringing Madrid, as the writer Nick Bohin once said, closer to Manila. This colonial social revolution was obviously meant to benefit the Spanish Empire by rationalizing exploitation and maximizing military power to fend off threats from within and outside the colony. That such a powerful state apparatus was deemed necessary in the first place was precisely the result of new challenges that came from unleashing economic and political forces in the archipelago. The contradictions that characterized the revolution grew out of this massive social, economic, and technological changes, grew out of this period of massive social, economic, and technological changes. As we have seen, the ilustrados, as well as the middle sectors that benefited from these reforms, were also those who felt their negative effects most acutely. Hailed to become integral parts of an expansive colonial machinery, they began to absorb its liberalizing logic, even as they found themselves racially discriminated against and excluded from fully enjoying its benefits. When they waged a revolution, they were in a sense seeking to collect the wages of political power they felt was due to them. And doing so was something that they could not have imagined, save for the profound social transformations of the last century. Caught up in these changes, they thus emerged as modern liberal subjects of a social revolution that, for various reasons, lurched, then stalled by the later 19th century. Ilustrados were joined by the empleados and principales in blaming anti-modern Spanish friars, violent guardias civiles, and reactionary government officials for blocking their path to progress by setting stringent limits to their material, cultural, and political advancement. In seeking independence from Spain, the revolutionists were attempting not only to consolidate and expand their prior gains, they also sought to unblock the modernizing path that had been laid out for them for over a century. The revolutionary pursuit of political empowerment through the conservation and expansion of prior social privileges and economic gains should sound familiar to anyone who knows anything about the country's history. It was exactly the same program, what some scholars have referred to as colonial or official nationalism, that was pursued by the United States occupying forces. Thus, the irony, rather than destroy the Republic and its Katipunan predecessor, the United States actually kept them alive for their own imperial purposes. They appointed Filipino lawyers to colonial courts and as minority members to the colonial executive body, reorganizing local governments as counterinsurgency measures, that is, to absorb many of the revolutionary leaders into the colonial bureaucracy. The United States held municipal elections in 1903 through a highly restrictive franchise similar to that of the First Republic. They allowed political parties and by 1907 established the first national colonial legislature called the Philippine Assembly. Nearly every member of this body had been part of the First Republic. Purchasing the friar lands from the Vatican, the Americans then sold them at bargain prices to the landed elites, thereby completing another key ambition of the Republic. Under U.S. sponsorship, new monuments to revolutionary heroes like Rizal were erected in 1912 and to Bonifacio in 1933. By 1935, a thoroughly Philippinized colonial state called a Commonwealth was established. Borrowing from the playbook of the Spaniards, the Americans also established a network of public schools, though with English rather than Spanish as the language of instruction. They encouraged the growth of private Catholic schools, but now with American and European priests and nuns replacing Spaniards. The Secular University of the Philippines was established in 1908. Originally staffed mostly by the Americans, the faculty was quickly replaced by Filipinos, many of whom had studied in the United States. Indeed, we can think of this project of Philippinization as the nationalization of colonial rule, whereby brown men and brown women were trained to carry the white man's burden. Such was possible only because both shared a liberal outlook. In the end, of course, Filipinos would unpack the American burden and reclaim it for their own modified ends. This brings us back to the question that we broached earlier, just how revolutionary was the revolution? Filipino nationalists in the propaganda movement, the Katipunan, and the Republic were clearly inspired by Spanish liberalism rather than anarchism, and much less by European socialism. Against the racist regime of Spain, they were propelled by the desire to unite and rule the country for their benefit, which they always assumed was identical to the benefit of the rest of the country. What was good for the elites, they insisted, was good for the rest of the nation, regardless of their class, gender, and ethnicity. This meant, above all, the rule of private property alongside formal and legal racial equality with the Spaniards, then later with the Americans. It did not mean socioeconomic inequality with those below them, whose value lay, as far as elites were concerned, in knowing their proper place in the service of those above. The Philippine Revolution was just nothing like the French Revolution. It was neither regicide nor mass slaughter of Spaniards. To my knowledge, only a handful of friars, the real kings of the country, were ever imprisoned or executed, and usually to the great reluctance of both leaders and common people. It was certainly not like the Russian or Chinese revolutions, with their emphasis on social leveling while keeping the party officials on top. Such entailed the breakup of large landholdings and the collectivization of labor and production through a highly centralized system, through highly centralized state apparatus that did not hesitate to use brutal means and exact great human costs. By contrast, there was in the Philippines considerable continuity between the Filipino colonial elites and those who fought, then governed in the revolutionary era, as well as under US occupation. With few exceptions, colonial and later national elites shared in the unshakable belief that they were the only ones capable of truly ruling the nation. They were convinced that their interests, predicated upon liberal ideas of legal equality among propertied individuals that placed non-propertied people as dependent others, on the patriarchal benevolence that kept women at the bottom, and on the cultural supremacy of a Christianized and Hispanized culture that excluded non-Christians and other so-called heathen foreigners, such as the Chinese, non-Christianized indigenous peoples, and Moros, were constitutive of the nations. Hence, they were deeply invested in their own survival and progress, which they saw as tantamount to that of the country. Conversely, they regarded any challenges to their authority to command and rule, especially from those below, as nothing less than an existential danger to the nation. The modernizing and liberal basis of the Philippine Revolution makes it analogous to the liberal revolutions of the Americas, rather than, say, other revolutions in Southeast Asia. Comparatively speaking, Filipino nationalism resonates with the Creole nationalism of both North and South America. We can see it as the earliest example of anti-colonial nationalism in Asia, only to the extent that it was also a belated manifestation of Creole nationalism across the Pacific. Like the wars of independence in the Americas from the late 18th to the early 19th century, the Philippine Revolution was led by men who identified upwards with the Spaniards and the English, speaking their language and seeking to become their legal and political equals, inasmuch as they felt they had long contributed to the material and military growth of their empires. Like the Americanos, the Filipinos had in time become the cultural equals, if not the betters, of their colonial masters. Yet they kept running up against the entrenched structures and recurring experiences of racial exclusion that fed animosities, even as it nurtured communities based on a common set of resentments and shared aspirations. In addition, they were also driven to deal with the social pressures of those below them, African slaves and Indian peoples on the part of Americanos, peasants and workers and non-property people, as well as Chinese and non-Chinese Hispanized and non-Christian Hispanized peoples on the part of the Filipinos. For both, revolution was a gendered affair, generating discourse of fraternity at the expense of sorority, keeping women at the periphery of national struggles. Faced with unbearable pressures from above, Creole nationalists across the Pacific were also compelled to contain and domesticate threats from below. To do so, both resorted to republican forms of government that necessarily made property, literacy, and in the case of North America, whiteness, conditions for political representations and legal equality. These criteria for liberal citizenship in new nations underwrote the preservation of hierarchy characteristic of colonial social relationships. The story is by now familiar. Nationalist modernity reassembled imperial structures, beginning with the territorial borders of the nation, its bureaucratic, military, linguistic, class, and gendered orders, and much of its legal architecture, even as it rejected its colonizing hold. What would it mean to consider the Philippine Revolution as something like the liberal revolutions of North and South America, led by Creole elites aiming at unity and homogeneity, in order to preserve the structures of hierarchy deeded by colonial rule? What would a more comparative consideration of the revolution allow us to see that might otherwise remain invisible? Would it, for example, require us to rethink the meaning of revolutionary heroism? Would it lead us to ask what it would mean to be a nationalist today in view of the liberal colonial foundations of the nation based on enforced social inequality in the name of the sanctity of private property? When we celebrate the revolution and its heroes, what and who are we celebrating exactly? And who exactly is this we? Who does it include? Who does it exclude? What sort of amnesia must we cultivate so that we can be proud of being what we proclaim ourselves to be when confronted with the contradictory legacies of the revolution? By way of conclusion, it is precisely the unfolding of these contradictions, their genealogy and their effects, the conflicts that they triggered, and the wars they unleashed not once, but again and again, that we continue to live with today. It forces us to confront yet again the most enduring trope in Philippine history, that of the unfinished revolution. As Nicole Kin once wrote, we need to ask when confronted with this trope, which revolution? The political, whose victors never cease to reassert themselves in the life of the nation, or the social, where the battle lines are always shifting, the terms of engagement and identities of the protagonists always fluid, and the outcomes far from certain and never final. Finally, what does an unpacking of revolutionary contradictions allow us to see in our current socio-political moment? For example, could we think of the revolution less as an emancipation from colonialism, as a continuation by other means, beginning with the First Republic to the present? One of the revolution's legacy, as we've seen, was the creation and consolidation of an oligarchical ruling class that continues to assert its hegemony today. It is this oligarchical autocracy with its roots in the colonial transformations of the 19th century that has arguably set the conditions for the emergence of authoritarian figures such as Rodrigo Duterte and the return of the Marcoses. It indicates the extent to which the political aspect of the revolution has succeeded resoundingly, while its social aspects have yet to be realized. Meanwhile, the so-called middle forces find themselves, as in the past, looking two ways, caught between the desire to achieve liberal modernity amid the forces of neoliberalism on one hand, and the fear of losing their place and having to turn to dictators to secure their positions on the other. It indicates the extent to which the political aspect of the revolution has succeeded resoundingly, while its social aspects continue to be wanting. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Vicente, for that really interesting reflection on the revolution and the contradictions that were embedded within that. So we have one question so far, and I invite other members of the audience to please use the Q&A function to submit any. And I also have a few things that I'd like to raise before some of those come in. But I'll begin with the first question that was posed by one of the members of the audience who, and I might broaden it out slightly, but the question was related to this audience member having encountered a historian who examined two twin counter-revolutionaries of Jose Rizal and Emilio Aguinaldo, and was interested in hearing your thoughts about this historian's observations, which go as follows. And this is a quote from what that person had encountered, and it goes like this, quote, "The Philippine Revolution was betrayed and sold by two counter-revolutions which effectively became one when Aguinaldo and Pedro Paterno sold it for $800,000 in the so-called Pact of Biak-na-Bato. An estimated 2 to 3 million Filipinos had died or were killed because of or by these twin counter-revolutionaries. But in the history books and other propaganda materials and commemorations sponsored by all the Philippine governments and endorsed and propagated by writers and intellectuals up to now, there's not even a mention of these counter-revolutionaries," end of quote. And I guess the wider question, perhaps to situate that in addition to this very specific quote, is thinking, and we see this in other governments and countries around the world, not just in Asia, but the treatment, say, of past histories through textbooks and other forms of ways of spreading a certain view of the past through educational channels and debates that take place then over revisions to those textbooks and things, and more or less a kind of a question about how the past is handled in order to try to create a future, I guess would be one way to put it. So any thoughts you have on that would be great.
Yeah, first of all, I'm puzzled by saying, with this person saying that no mention of Aguinaldo and Rizal are seen in textbooks. There is nothing but Rizal and Aguinaldo in many of these textbooks. It's just the way they're characterized. Certainly, some people would refer to them as counter-revolutionaries. Example of Rizal rejecting allying with the revolution when he was asked to join. Aguinaldo, somewhat more complicated, and again, both are very complicated responses, right? Rizal felt not so much at the revolution, he wasn't so much against the revolution as he was against the timing of the revolution, feeling that revolution at that moment, 1896, when it exploded, was not yet the right time. It would result in lots and lots of deaths, that the revolutionary forces were not yet prepared to launch a revolution. So he was against the timing rather than the revolution itself. And the evidence of that is everywhere in his writings and so forth. In the case of Aguinaldo, certainly he joined the revolution and he led it. And he was very successful in the early stages in Cavite, to the point that they were able to drive out the Spaniards. And it was only later on that, in the face of growing Spanish pressure and then eventually American pressure, but first growing Spanish pressure, he was compelled to sign the Treaty of Biak-na-Bato, but had no intention of giving up. Since the moment he went into exile into Hong Kong, he immediately organized a junta and consulted with American diplomats from Singapore and various other places, planning to return to the Philippines. So whether or not what he did was counter-revolutionary is up for debate. I would beg to disagree. The question is, what sort of revolution did they have in mind, right? Not that he was a counter-revolutionary, but which is a term I don't use. What kind of revolution did they have in mind? I think that's the more important question. So.
Okay.
And by the way, I should emphasize that my account of the revolution is certainly not definitive. I mean, it's progressing, it's tentative, it's contingent, and bound to revision. And I'm sure many here is more familiar with the history of the revolution would probably violently disagree with some of my claims, and that's okay. I mean, it's everything's up for debate. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just as a quick follow-up to that comment, then as well, are there new documents and archives that are coming available that weren't previously available that help to write this history in a different way?
Well, certainly the documents in Jim Richardson's Light of Liberty
in the Katipunan.
On the Katipunan are very helpful. Constantly new stuff coming up when people are looking at the so-called insurgent records. It was compiled by, these were captured documents by the Americans. Many of them remain in microfilms, unread. There's a brief compilation, relatively brief, 5-volume compilation excerpts that Renato Constantino had edited, and so forth. So I mean, there's always stuff coming out, and the history of the revolution is far from having been exhausted, and the archival materials continue to yield all sorts of interesting stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been noticing, I mean, recently, just different types of materials, say, for example, for the Vietnam War, for another history that constantly is rewritten, but also new things coming out in terms of telling other sides that weren't previously available. Great. So the second question that came in here is, could you please tell us if there was anything like a Marxist study society in the Philippines in the late 19th century that is a leftist social revolutionary alternative to the elite, upward-looking revolutionary organization that ended up dominating the late colonial political scene?
No. Isabelo Duroches, when he came back from imprisonment in Barcelona, brought with him a suitcase full of Marxist literature, and this was around 1902, 19, I'm not sure exactly, maybe 1901, 1902, somebody could correct me on this, but he was the first one to introduce Marxism in the Philippines, or literature by Marx. Rizal never read Marx, Aguinaldo never read Marx, none of these guys ever read Marx. As I said, they were mostly influenced by liberal notions and overlaid with Catholic ideas. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Which made me, when I was listening to your talk, then to think a little bit about. I mean, it's very interesting where we have this situation where, of course, the internal sort of causes or history is central to the story here, but then you also have this access and opening up to new flows of information, new flows of ideas that are coming in, sounding primarily through Spain and through Europe. It sounds like, but we know that other ideas were also circulating around within Southeast Asia. Was there any flow of people, ideas that were important in the Philippines that were coming from other parts of Southeast Asia at that time, as intellectuals moved around and had their own forms of connections and networks that extended to other parts of the world as well?
Well, certainly Japan was an important point of influence, as Nicole Kuhn, sort of shows in her own work. And some of those people have shown, Japan was always an inspiration to many of the Filipino nationalist leaders at this time, as an example of an Asian country that had managed to resist colonization by marshaling its own resources and at the same time borrowing, technologies and ideas from the West. Yeah, so there was Japan. I'm not sure about China. I'm sure there was probably stuff coming out of China as well. But if it did come out of China, it probably came through Japan. Much less from Indonesia at this time. Indonesia later would become important, in the early 20th century. But as far as I can tell, and again, people could correct me if I'm wrong, it was primarily Japan. Through Japan was the sort of non-Western sort of point of connection for many of the Ilustrados and many of the other Filipino leaders.
Yeah, that was actually going to be the next follow-up was to ask about Japan, because I mean, I think most, well, at least myself, not being a specialist of this area, tend to think of the Japanese kind of influence coming much later in the 40s with the occupation and all of that. I wonder how that impacted that period leading up to, say, 46 and independence, just in terms of what happened during that period, from the 20s up through the 1940s.
Yeah. No, as I say, Japan was an inspiration, not just for the 19th century nationalists, but all through the early 20th century, who saw Japan, nationalists who saw Japan, as I said, a kind of an alternative to the United States. And in fact, many of a number, not many, but a small number of revolutionary leaders who resisted co-optation into the U.S. colonial regime ended up being exiled in Japan. And the most famous one being Artemio Ricarte, who ended up in Yokohama, and would follow the Japanese when they came to occupy the Philippines. So Japan continued to be an important point of inspiration, and the United States recognized that and suspected of Japan of fomenting revolution and uprisings and so forth. So there's a great new book called Menace to Empire by my colleague Moonho Jung that talks about the centrality of Japan in the imagination of many Asian and Asian American revolutionaries and radicals, as well as in the imagination of U.S. colonial officials, who sought to clamp down on Japanese influence as well. So,
yeah, it's really quite complicated then, right? Because you have some then during the occupation that were sympathizing or were supporting Japan as well, as far as I understand it. So, So let's see. Again, anybody from the audience who also has some questions, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. And we don't have any other questions right now, so I can be kind of selfish here, I guess, in terms of engaging with you on some other questions here as well. I guess one of the questions that I had was related to the thread that you're drawing from this revolutionary period up to the present day, and sort of maybe thinking a little bit about what are some of the conditions for the existence of this kind of structural carry forward of a certain type of political, social structures that came from that period that you think are that have led to the situation that we find in the present day. Besides just noting kind of similarities about it, what's allowing that to continue forward, do you think? I mean, just taking a look or speculating about that.
Yeah, one of the things that we see today, and a lot of critical analysis of the current political situation, is so much attention has been put on social media. It's as if social media was at fault. It's as if social media created the return of the Marxists and so forth. And this sort of incredible attention, or what I sometimes think of as fetishization of social media, is carried out at the expense of sort of much larger historical analysis of the conditions of possibility that might lead to something like authoritarianism in the Philippines. And one of the things I was simply trying to say is that this kind of authoritarianism wouldn't be possible without something that would have supported it, that would have lent it material as well as ideological and cultural support, and that is to say the existence of an oligarchical autocracy. And if you trace the history of the Philippines, I mean, there are many strands, and one of the strands that you can trace that leads you up to the present is the formation and the incredible tenacity, the incredible persistence of this oligarchical autocracy, through the Spanish, American, Japanese, post-colonial, Marcos and post-martial law period. You have this sort of investment, or they have this idea that somehow only the oligarchy can rule, that anything else aside from the oligarchy would be unthinkable. And that this oligarchy continues to grow, continues to mutate, and certainly they have conflicts within each other. I mean, like the Bonifacio Aguinaldo conflict. There's certainly sort of intra-class conflicts among the oligarchy, but nonetheless, the structure of elite rule, of what some people have called elite democracy, continues to this day. This is a very colonial phenomena, right? And so in some ways, when people talk about structured Philippine politics, it still is a very colonial kind of politics. And my interest has simply been to ask, how has that come about? Why does it persist? And not only that, why does it enjoy, despite all sorts of contestations and challenges, why does it continue to enjoy hegemony? That is to say, why does the majority of the people seem to accede, seem to invest in this particular structure? Hence you have a majority of the people voting for the Marxists, right? Why is it that poor people think that it's better for rich people to rule them? It's as simple as that. Right. And why has there been no effective counter hegemony that has formed? I mean, of course, there have been attempts, but they have been, they go through periods of, surging and then falling apart. Radical alternatives, especially today, radical alternatives are nowhere to be found, which doesn't mean that resistance doesn't exist. I mean, resistances exist all the time, right? But these resistances never coagulate, never crystallize into effective movements. I mean, I think something like Leni Robredo is a perfect example of that, right? She doesn't present so much as an alternative, as a point of resistance that can be effective in certain ways, but cannot effectively challenge the structural conditions of this oligarchy, right? And right now, there is nothing in the Philippines, as far as I'm concerned, or as far as many people are concerned, there's nothing in the Philippines that seems to be able to be in a position to launch a kind of structural challenge to this particular movement. So we're stuck with living out this history. And in many cases, Independence Day celebrations, Rizal Day celebrations, all of this stuff, glorifying these conditions. And frankly, it makes it puts me in a very sort of pessimistic mode. So.
Sure, because it further entrenches precisely
Absolutely.
those structures that
Yeah.
you're talking about.
Yeah.
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 No, it is shocking
Absolutely.
it's so shocking to see, and it's not just in the Philippines that we see this all around the world, and I see it every
Oh
day in
yeah.
the
Oh
United
yeah.
States too,
Oh
particularly
yeah. Oh yeah.
the people voting in ways that are completely against their own interests for
That's right.
whatever reason, and how does one then combat that kind of or try to transform the hearts and minds of those that are caught
Well,
up in that?
yeah.
And I think it came to the fore for me when around this, well, a little bit later, but
Yeah.
last year
Yeah.
in the lead up to the elections, and having a talk by Maritas Vitug, who was talking about the Philippine Sea issues and the Chinese claims over what they call the South China Sea. And the interesting fact that you had people that, the fishermen and things that were still supporting the pro-China policy, even though this was going to lead to lack of access to the fishing grounds and all of this. So that really struck me as kind of one of these strange contradictions that lurks in all of this, and brings it. So that's why I was really interested in your take on the kind of other structural features or conditions that have allowed these to change. And I guess since you do work in a comparative context of looking around the world at similar movements, have you seen I was trying to think, is there a successful movement where you've seen a challenge to that, where the opposition to, let's say, longstanding structural features like what you find in the Philippines have been successful?
I mean, of course, there are many examples in history. More recently, Latin America, Chile, and some other countries in Latin America, where you have left-wing governments who have succeeded. Brazil at one point, and then of course Lula was replaced by Bolsonaro, and we don't know what's going to happen next now. So there are many examples. I mean, in the United States, I mean, you had the example of the civil rights movement. The long civil rights movement, which at one point was very successful in overthrowing some of the most obnoxious and horrible structures of power in the United States and opening up certain possibilities. But of course, what happens is it always meets up with pushback. As I said, the dialectic of social change is such that you can have sort of uprisings and revolts that are momentarily successful and then meet up with certain kinds of historical limits, and then stuff changes. In the Philippines, as I said, the revolution itself is kind of interesting. You have this upsurge, but at the same and you have these moments of radical attempts at social leveling, but they tend to be disaggregated, and they tend to be suppressed, not just by the Republic, but of course by colonial powers as well. But the possibility is always there. In other words, it's always it's always percolating. What will trigger it? What will result in sort of a generalized resistances? It's hard to tell. It's also usually very contingent. If certain conditions are met, then you can have something much more radical and much more dramatic. But as I said, in many parts of the world, I mean, the United States, including the United States, it's really difficult to see any kind of sort of radical movements right now, but especially in the Philippines. So, but who knows? I mean, I'm sure it's a temporary thing, that something else will emerge eventually. But what that will be, that's up for the historian of the future, as it were, to figure out. So.
Yeah. And often when we look around the world historically, when these things have happened, not all of these have been necessarily planned. Some have come about through just strange historical circumstances that lead to something that catalyzes things. So, okay, we've got a few more questions that have come in here too. One is asking if you could explain again why you think Bonifacio and his urban middle class revolutionaries were not interested in social change. And then I think this is a follow on to that by the same person who said that their condition was far less favorable than the one of the Ilustrados, and a big part of urban middle class in Europe at that time were looking for social change. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's hard to find evidence. I mean, Was Bonifacio interested in social leveling? Was he interested in sort of, radically rethinking relations of power? Well, he was, to the extent that he was intent on replacing the Spaniards and neutralizing the power of Spanish friars. But beyond that, if you read the literature of people like Emilio Jacinto, who's one of the intellectuals of the movement, it was really more about sort of leading virtuous lives, showing a certain kind of benevolence and kindness to one another, which in its context could have a radicalizing effect. I have no doubt, but in terms of much more sort of far-reaching effects, like redistribution of property, for example, the end of patriarchy. None of that figured in people like Bonifacio, right? And the figure of Bonifacio is really problematic. All kinds of conflicting accounts of his personality, of his aspirations, his temper. All of this stuff that made the idea of him as a kind of a radical revolutionary leader, sort of very difficult to sustain. So, yeah.
Okay.
As you can see, I'm not much for national heroes.
Yeah. Well, we often realize that often these national hero types, we can scratch the surface and you find something very different. I think. From what I've understand, Bonifacio is similar to that in some ways too, of challenges to those. So this question is related to how your point about elite capture, doesn't it also have a great deal to do with the colossal cost of running for office in an archipelago like the Philippines, much of which remains undigitized? Patron-client expectations among voters continues to be a problem as well, doesn't it?
No doubt. Yeah, no doubt. The forms of electoral politics, the structures, the problems of running for office and so forth, makes it very difficult for non-elites, or at least those who don't have the money to run for offices, right? And again, these conditions, go back a long way, and very much rooted in colonial conditions. So, if people wanted to address the lack of democracy, as it were, the undemocratic. See, what you have in the Philippines is democratic forms that result in undemocratic results or undemocratic social relations, right? So you have elections, which are very democratic, but because of the way they're run and because of the limitations they impose, they result in the election of wealthy, influential patron types, so undemocratic results, right? And so, how do you address that question of how do you align democratic forms with democratic results? You have to have some sort of social revolution, social leveling. You have to address income inequality. You have to address the political education of people. In other words, you have to address the sort of the hierarchies, social hierarchies that exist that allow for these kinds of things to happen. You have to address the influence of capitalism and neoliberalism and so forth and so on. So it's a whole set of complex questions that need to be addressed, other than, for example, forcing Facebook, right, to do something about their political advertising. It's not just about social media, contrary to Maria Ressa, who's a dear friend, but nonetheless, these are places where I disagree with her. That just tend to sort of speak very narrowly about what's wrong with Philippine politics, when in fact there's a whole set of other complicated issues that have deep historical roots. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see, a new question just came in too about how this audience member who is curious how the struggles for the identity of the revolution translated to the US or Americans at that time. In the press, the Philippines was first an ally, then an enemy, yet in your discussion illustrates how the structure of the revolution, maintaining and expanding the landowning elite, was in keeping with US political culture. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the argument simply is that revolutionary leaders and Republican leaders, the elites, shared a largely liberal perspective United States colonizers, and that provided them with a common ground. Where they disagreed was on the question of independence and the limits of political autonomy. That was a constant source of a struggle, and in large part, it had racial roots because the United States felt Filipinos were racially inferior, were incapable of governing themselves, had to be controlled, had to be civilized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Filipinos will always come back and say, well, we're just like Americans and we were better than you. We believe in the same things. And indeed, there was a lot more in common between Americans and Filipinos, which is why they could eventually move towards independence in 1946. So that would be my response.
Mm-hmm. One question that came to my mind as you've talked a little bit about the and tried to limit, say, thinking of a direct causality, say, between just social media and some of the successes politically that have happened in this cycle and as well, raises the question then in my mind about the situation in the modern or contemporary period is very different, obviously, than the flows of information that were available in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. Are there, thinking about traditional uses of social media aside, but just access to information, writers, thinkers, intellectual flows that could come into the Philippines much more directly through other channels now that could change the sort of ability for the growth of opposition parties, opposition leaders, and things like that. Is there any thought that can have some kind of an impact? The obvious, counter to that is when regimes try to say what you might find in China, control the flow of internet traffic into the country wholesale and limit what is available. But anyway, your thoughts on just the role of that, beyond just say the kind of Facebook, Instagram kind of stuff, but more flows of information.
Yeah, no, I mean, social media is important. Flows of information are very important. But the way in which, the way I look at it is how can these information flows or these social media activities, how can they make a difference? And I don't think they can unless they're connected to a larger social movement, unless they're part of a larger architecture of opposition. Right, an architecture of opposition that seeks to, as I said, address, deep-rooted structural questions, right, rather than simply replicate them, under a new guise, right? So the question of liberal oppositions are all well and good, and they certainly, and I'm not saying that they don't make a difference. They certainly can make a difference, but liberal oppositions simply result in, I think, in my opinion, they simply result in sort of mitigating rather than replacing certain issues or certain questions. Property, poverty, patriarchy, all of these stuff. Liberal opposition do very little to actually address those things, and so what we need is something much more dramatic, much more radical. The Communist Party certainly tried to do that, and still, in some ways, they're still trying to do that. But of course, the Communist Party has sort of lagged, and it's been, for all kinds of reasons, has been sort of, simply not effective. Let's put it that way. Even the party has had its limits in terms of trying to imagine what an opposition would look like going forward. And so I don't know. It's fine. And as I said, looking into the future, even the question of liberal opposition is, it's a big question mark. Who's there? What is the opposition doing right now? How are they organizing? What kinds of new ideas are they putting forth? Who are the new figures of the opposition? They're the same old people. The same old people, which is not to say they're not good people. They're certainly very good people with great intentions, and some of them have great visions. But nothing is happening in terms of like organizing themselves, and instead what you have are these sort of NGO type organizations that are meant to help people. And as I said, I think that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. Anything to alleviate people's plights, right? But whether or not they will result in long-term change, what you have right now is precisely this oligarchical ruling class riding on its privileges, sort of coasting on its history of power, and consolidating its relations of power, reproducing its family, its families, and so forth. They're the ones with a plan. They're the ones with the structure, right? I don't know how else to challenge them. So at this point, I mean, I don't know who else or how else to challenge them.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that occurred to me as you were speaking as well is, and particularly this argument about the revolution really supporting regime change rather than social transformation, was that I think in every revolutionary movement or radical political or times of hope for radical change that may not reach its full goals, there's always certain factions of that have lost out or fallen by the wayside that actually don't make it into our historical record very easily. Do you see any glimpses of, I mean, sort of now looking back over that same terrain, which you've spoken about here in terms of what happened with those who seem to have been they're celebrated as the successful revolutionaries, but when one looks at actually what happened, one sees something rather different. But were there some of these other possibilities, or what were the possibilities that were there that didn't quite win the day?
Yeah, as I mentioned in the paper, there were these radical waves, right, of folks who came from below, who came from the masses or from working classes, who sought to assert, their rights, and for example, occupy hacienda lands, burn government buildings and structures, and demand equality, and not just subordination. And there have been histories written about them, these popular movements, so to speak, and many of them have, as I said, pushed through. You have the Sacdalistas, you have the Guardianor, you have all these sort of colorum sects who have, in some ways, retreated from society, established their own domains. Some of them continue to exist today, although they're not as revolutionary as they used to be. I mean, they tend to be much more quiet. So yeah, I mean, as I said, these movements are there, and their legacy, have been recorded by certain historians, and so forth. But they're not taught. They're certainly not included in the sort of heroic celebrations of the revolution. They're not put forth as sort of alternative visions of what could have been. Instead, they're largely forgotten, right? And you have to dig. You have to find, these instances and these groups for examples, right? But they're there. They're there.
And was part of the problem that they just, you can have these momentary paroxysms of violence that erupt, or even a kind of a sort of desperate, last act of desperation is destruction, versus a kind of working, congealing together as groups that might have some success. I mean, I guess there probably sounds like there wasn't a lot of kind of co-conspirating, if you will, or working together as groups, or were they inhibited in that in structural ways by the system as it was moving forward?
Well, I think it's much simpler than that. I think they were met with the violent, forces of the state, whether it was a Republican state or the colonial state, that just simply it destroyed them, that crushed them, right? but aside from these movements, as I said, there are these acts of resistances that never stop, that continue. A great place to look for is in art and literature. The
Yeah.
arts and literatures of the Philippines are full of these very rich sort of acts of resistances that may not coagulate, may not rise to the level of revolutionary movements, but certainly exist as this oasis of sort of negation, of taking exception, of providing utopic possibilities. Someone like Nefertiti Tadiar, for example, in her books, has very beautifully laid out what some of these acts of resistances in culture, in art, and in painting and so forth, performances could look like, right? So you have these sort of, whether they're undertaken by individuals or whether they're undertaken by smaller groups, they continue to exist, and they continue to inspire alternative ways of thinking. So I mean, that's where some kind of hope exists. Not optimism, but certainly hope, right?
Yeah. No, I always think of that, these are in some cases extraordinary acts of both creativity and bravery at the same time, often going together, but also a kind of kindling or keeping of a flame that can transcend the lack of strong institutions of opposition, but can carry that forward through lasting works. Yeah. Okay. We've hit exactly 5:30, which is perfect, actually. So let me just first extend a thank you very much to you, Vicente, for this rethinking of the revolution and how revolutionary it was, and also unpacking some of the dynamics underneath it all and the results of that. Really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts with us today, and thank you to the audience for joining in, and hope that everybody can make it back on November 17th at 4 p.m. for Elsa Clave's talk on the footprints of Islamicization in the Philippines as well. So thank you again. I look forward. We'll keep an eye on your work and your writing, and look forward to keep learning from you, Vicente. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, take care.
Bye. Yeah,
Bye-bye.
You too. Yeah, bye.